David. And I want you to know any language or wording that stands out, an attitude that David has that stands out, any biblical references or anything like that. So we're going to read 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 10 through 20. So follow along with me as we read. It says, "Therefore, David blessed the Lord in the presence of all the assembly. And David said, 'Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. But who am I? And what is my people that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. For we are strangers before you and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no abiding. Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own. I know, my God, that you test the heart and have pleasure in uprightness. In the uprightness of my heart, I have freely offered all these things, and now I have seen your people who are present here offering freely and joyously to you. O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, our fathers, keep forever such purposes and thoughts in the hearts of your people, and direct their hearts toward you. Grant to Solomon my son a whole heart, that he may keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, performing all, and that he may build the palace for which I have made provision.' Then David said to all the assembly, 'Bless the Lord your God.' And all the assembly blessed the Lord, the God of their fathers, and bowed their heads and paid homage to the Lord and to the king." All right, so what are some things that you noticed in those verses, in David's prayer? What are some things that stood out to you?
What stood out to me was the way he raised up and he praised God before he prayed and told God of his blessing and his greatness before he got to the riches about what God had given him.
Mm-hmm.
He gave God the glory first.
Yeah, it's good.
Verse 3 caught my attention more because I have set my affection to the house of my God. We need to make sure our affection is not just for what things that are around us. You know, we have to have our affection. And when he asked God to give Solomon a whole heart, that's something I thought that was really too, that he prayed for his son to have a whole heart.
Yeah.
As we all want ourselves and our children to be.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Any other thoughts? Any online thoughts? Oh, we're having some technical difficulties. If you are trying to contribute online, I'm sorry for any technical difficulties you are experiencing. It wouldn't be a Sunday or a Wednesday without some technical difficulties. I'm not even going to go into the amount of time spent before we started on trying to get things right technically. Anyway, well, some things that I noticed, and I think you were all hitting on it as well, is David has a heart of praise. Just absolute praise to God. I mean, not holding anything back, it feels, right? Just this open, warm praise, this affectionate praise to God. And it is praise and then it moves to gratitude, right? thank you, right? And he gives this, and it's in this humility, and it's this understanding. He says it so often, all this is yours. We are just getting to use it.
I noticed he went, if you think about it, it goes all the way back when he was in the pasture field with the sheep, where all his psalms is nothing but praise and worship and glory for God all the way through his life.
That's right. That's right. So we're seeing in this prayer, in this praise, this song, a reminiscence of when he first discovered the Lord, right? And so it's this it's taking him back, and we see this perspective of this kingdom is yours, God. The resources are yours. The people are yours. Everything is yours. It is so important to pray over the legacy we will leave. I want to say that again because I want us to think about that. It is so important to pray over the legacy that we will leave. When we pray over the legacy that we'll leave, it puts that inheritance into the right perspective for us. Right? The legacy that we're going to leave, it's God's. God's going to do it. We get to be a part. I did not accomplish this. This is the Lord's. But it also teaches and communicates the right perspective for them. Right? As we're praying over this, as we are committing this to the Lord, it is putting our heart and mind into perspective, and it is passing on perspective to those who are coming after. It reminds us that God is in control. It reminds us to trust God with our children and our grandchildren, with our resources, with our name. It reminds us to trust God. And it reminds us that everything we pass on is for God's glory, not ours. And we're talking, I'm using this parenting analogy. I'm referencing it to parents and grandparents right now, but it's more than that. But we can see it through that lens very easily as we are passing things on, a godly legacy on to our kids or our grandkids. It's for God's glory, not for our glory, not for our kids' glory, not for our grandkids' glory. Right? As we do this, it's reminding us everything we do, everything that I get to be a part of, that I get to invest in, that I get to contribute to, and I get to cast a vision for, all of that is for the glory of God.
I think we have to keep in mind, legacy doesn't start with us.
Yeah.
We're contributing to a legacy that started.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we think about it, it started, for David, it started Abraham, right? And he recognized it. Started with Abraham. And then God chose David's family among all the tribes of, all the families of Judah, right? And out of all of the people in his family, he chose David. And it's this perspective of, it didn't start with me. I'm contributing to it. And it didn't start with whoever came right before me either. It's from the Lord. It's from the Lord. As we look at verse 20, David's prayer, it went beyond himself, which I think is really cool. I think I'm going to go back. I want to look at verse 20. Then David said to the assembly, so he prayed this huge prayer of praise and thankfulness. And then he looks out at all the people and he says, bless the Lord. Now it's your turn. Now it's your turn. And it goes beyond himself. It goes beyond his heart. He taught the people and his son how to pray. And then he gave them the opportunity, instruction, and encouragement to do it themselves. I'm going to bless the Lord. This is in the right perspective for me. Now it's your turn. You bless the Lord. Put it in the right perspective. Give God glory for what he is doing in our midst. And so, as we think about this, just trying to think about it for us, because we're going to have to wrap up here in a minute. Some questions for reflection. Do you pray for your legacy? Whether that is what you are leaving, the faith you are leaving, the example you are leaving, or the people that you are leaving it to. Do you pray for your legacy? Have you committed your legacy to God? Have you dedicated your legacy to the Lord? Or is it still yours? Is it still for your glory? Have you committed it to the Lord? Is it for the glory of the Lord? And then, are you modeling this legacy? Are you modeling it? When we think practically speaking, this is everyday Christian discipleship. To have a faith and model it. Teach it and model it. Whether it's your family, it's your friends. It is yourself cultivating your relationship with the Lord and then bringing others to. Bringing others along. This is what Jesus did. This is what we are called to do. And so, the last action, there were 4, right? The first one was he contributed to the legacy. He cast a vision for the legacy. He commits the legacy to the Lord. And the last one, he confidently passes on the legacy. He confidently passes on the legacy. We're going to read 1 Chronicles 29, verses 22 through 28. And this is such a sweet verse, thinking about just the life of King David in the closing of his years. But it says, "And they ate and drank before the Lord on that day with great gladness. And they made Solomon, the son of David, king the second time." Pause. Let me explain that. Remember when I told you that Adonijah raised himself up against David and Solomon to be king? And David had to go and establish Solomon as king? Well, he had to do that. And after he established Solomon as the king, he then did all of the stuff that we read about. And now he is like officially. First one was like, let me put the foot in the door and stake the claim so that none of my other sons try to do this. I'm making Solomon as king. And so then all this, he raises up all this stuff for the temple and all that. And then now, the second time, he's now like officially, right? He's officially establishing him as king. So it says, they made Solomon the son of David king the second time, and they anointed him as prince for the Lord, as Zadok as priest. Then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king in place of David his father, and he prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. All the leaders and the mighty men, and also all the sons of King David, pledged their allegiance to King Solomon. And the Lord made Solomon very great in the sight of all Israel, and bestowed on him such royal majesty as had not been on any king before him in Israel. Thus David the son of Jesse reigned over all Israel. The time that he reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. And then he died at a good age, full of days, riches, and honor. And Solomon his son reigned in his place. I think it's just a beautiful ending to that story of King David. David passed the torch to Solomon before he died. Before he died. The people followed Solomon, and David was able to sit back and watch how the legacy was continued on by his son. This is something that stood out to me, particularly because this year as a church, one of our goals for the year was leadership development. And that's something that we as staff and elders have been kind of looking at. And we've been going through some training on how to develop new leaders. And one of the major points of this is passing on that legacy instead of leaving a hole to be filled when you're gone. What are you doing right now to go ahead and start passing that on so that when you are gone, for whatever reason, you're not leaving a hole that someone else has to play catch up to try to fill? And so this legacy, we see that David established Solomon before he died. It wasn't that, and David held on to his throne to his bitter end. And then when he died, they finally said, okay, well, we'll make Solomon king then. And there was this span where there was all these other people trying to fight for the kingship. No, David was alive. It doesn't say that he made Solomon king and then died. It says that he made Solomon king. The people followed Solomon, and David was able to then sit back, hand it off, and die when he was full of years. This legacy went so far beyond what David or Solomon could see. And so I want to look at, I'm going to do this real quickly. We're going to look at two more scriptures, and it's going to answer Linda's question here. But Linda's question a minute ago was, well, does the house of David still stand? Yes, because God's promise and covenant to David was so far beyond Solomon. And so let's look at Matthew. We're going to look at 4 verses in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, verse 6, verse 16, and verse 17. And you probably know these verses. This is part of the genealogy of Jesus. It says, and I'm skipping over to get to the points that are applicable to our discussion tonight, but it says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Verse 6, then it gives a bunch of names from Abraham all the way down to, and Jesse, the father of David, the king. And David was the follower of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And then it skips down, a whole bunch of names. And then it gets down to verse 16, and it says, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. God's covenant with David was faithful, and the kingship stayed until it got to Jesus. And guess what? Jesus still holds on to that throne because Jesus is still alive. He doesn't have to pass that on to anybody because it stops with him. And so God's covenant was faithful from David to Jesus, and Jesus is king, not just over all of Israel, but over all. And this is where we find ourselves as we are looking at King David's example of worshiping God in every season. How does our worship of God expand beyond ourselves? So David's worship of God went so far beyond him, right? It has impacted, it's left a legacy, not just for his son Solomon, but for us. And it went to Jesus, and it went all over. We get to read the Psalms, we get to read the life of David in our Bibles, and we get to be impacted by this legacy. So the question is, how do we live this life? How do we pass on this godly legacy? So to wrap us up, I just want to read some of my favorite verses. It's out of Hebrews chapter 11. And this is very practical for us. But